And that's really the moment in which I realized that the left was lying to me.
Oh, you sweet, sweet summer child. Hey, everybody, I'm Brad Polumbo, and welcome back to the Damage Control Podcast, where we are reclaiming the debate over LGBT issues from the crazy people who've taken it over. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe and stick around, and if you're watching us on YouTube, please do consider hitting that like button and commenting with your thoughts as we go along. I do read the comments. Today, in a first for the Damage Control Podcast, we're featuring a long-form conversation with a detransitioner, a young woman named Maia who thought she identified as transgender, but grew to realize that it wasn't a good fit for her. We dive deep into her personal journey and everything that's leading some young people astray in this modern movement. Buckle up and get ready for a fascinating conversation. All right, Maia, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Brad, for having me. I really appreciate this opportunity.
Yeah, of course. I have been meaning to for some time to have a conversation with a detransitioner because I think it's so important. There's so many out there I've encountered online. There's a couple that get almost all the attention, but there's so many people with stories to tell, and I'm really interested in going into yours in a little bit of depth. So, I know that you first started identifying as transgender around age 12. Take us back then. How did you even encounter this idea in the first place?
Yeah, so I was 12 in the year 2012, so trans was not a popular topic of discussion back then. I think what started it all really is the fact that I got an iPad for my 12th birthday. So I had, all of human information at my fingertips. And a lot of things were going on when I was 12, which I believe informed or sort of catalyzed the eventual trans identity. I was starting to, experience a lot of weird sensations in my body when I was 12.
That's that time.
Yeah, that's the time. And I remember one day in class, we were engaging in the American cultural ritual of taking a stack of worksheets and passing it down. Every American is familiar, who has been to school is familiar with the idea of take a worksheet and pass it down. So I was doing that, and it was a total non-event until one day when I was 12 and my hand briefly brushed by the hand of one of my female classmates. And suddenly I noticed a bunch of odd sensations in my body, like my heart rate decided to skyrocket. My whole body warmed up, and it felt like it was like a summer heat that was just overcoming the air conditioning unit. I felt kind of dizzy and sweaty, but at the same time, my mouth became totally dry. And when I opened my mouth to try to apologize to this girl for the brief, touch of our hands, no words came out. So I didn't know what to make of these feelings. I come from a family that is very intellectual. So the concept of romantic attraction, or as it would have been known to me as a 12-year-old, crushes, that was not discussed. I actually thought that crush was the orange soda, that my peer group was just obsessed with, in the same way as they were obsessed with silly boards, kendamas, or silly bands, kendamas, and penny boards. But this crush, this obsession with the orange soda didn't seem to wane. It just became stronger and stronger with time. Of course, it was only much later that I learned that this crush that my classmates were obsessed with was not an orange soda. And because I was having all of these odd symptoms in my body, I've always been a bit of a researcher as a child. And I was really obsessed with medical topics from a very young age. From about the age of 8 or 9, I became obsessed with the world's tallest people and the condition that makes them so tall, which is a pituitary tumor called acromegaly, which causes asymmetric growth. So I'd say that obsession was my first extremely in-depth intellectual obsession. And so I was already primed to be interested in medical topics. So I started to have all of these weird symptoms in my body. And like the good little researcher that I was, I went to WebMD and typed my symptoms in. And if there's anything that anybody knows about WebMD, it's that you can type in the most normal body aches and pains, and WebMD will tell you that you're dying. So I typed my symptoms into WebMD, and it generated results of at least 3 possible neurodegenerative conditions that were going to likely kill me. So I was already really distressed around that time, but somewhere along the line, I had figured out that, hanging around girls makes me have these weird symptoms in my body that makes it, damn near impossible for me to get a coherent sentence out. So I started hanging out with the boys because I didn't feel those feelings. And so now I'm in this male peer group, which is pretty different for me because as a kid, because of my intellectual interests, I didn't really know how to relate to kids my own age. So I never really had friends that were the same age as me, certainly not close and enduring friendships. I was more friends with the teachers. But so now I'm in a friend group of boys, and I finally discover like the joys of being in a peer group. And we all, like me and the boys, we all form like a strategic alliance to basically incessantly prank the teachers. And we do this in order to get the attention of the girls. Although none of us discussed this explicitly, it seemed to be the same thing that we were all going for. So I didn't really know how to make sense of anything that was going on with me within my body and sort of within the broader social surroundings. And what ended up happening is that, so I'd grown up in a progressive American city on the West Coast. So I'd seen, people who are very clearly, very obviously male, wearing skirts and dresses. And it had been explained to me as a sex change, as somebody who has, a gendered soul, like a woman's soul inside of a man's body. So I knew
Explained
about
to
the
you by
concepts.
who?
Oh, well, I think it had been covered on the radio once, like on
Okay.
National Public Radio. And maybe my parents explained it to me in that way. I'm not, it was way before I was 12 even, but I was exposed to the concept of a sex change. But I thought that, sex changes only apply to men who want to be women. So being the little researcher that I was, I wanted to know, whether or not I could do the same thing that these men were doing when they became women, but to do it, from a female and then become male. Especially because, I, when I was in this male peer group, I started to really enjoy their sense of style. Like I wanted to wear what they were wearing, but even more than that, I wanted to wear what Ellen DeGeneres was wearing because I'd seen a few clips of the Ellen Show, and I was at that age where I was sort of starting to, develop my own style for the first time because really you can't really, put a 12-year-old in whatever you want them to wear. They're going to develop their own sense of style eventually. And so my style was at least my aspirations were to wear like fashionable men's clothes and to dress in the way that my male peers who I really identified with were dressing. And I pretty quickly learned that that was socially unacceptable mostly from adults in my life. And I think that is really what all of these things together are really what precipitated my Google search to try to figure out, can a woman become a man?
So
And yeah,
the thing about listening to your story that is so glaring to me and so fascinating to me because it resonates with a lot of what I've heard from other people is that I know some individuals, my friend Blair White is one of them, who from 4 or 5 years old can remember feeling like they are trapped in the wrong body and they are the wrong sex. They're not what they're supposed to. But that is a very different cohort of trans than what we're seeing now, especially young females in their teenage years suddenly deciding that they are transgender or that they should become men, right? And what struck me about your description of a scenario is that you hadn't had gender dysphoria growing up as a young child, right?
no, I hadn't. I
Even
just,
before
of
then?
course, oh yeah, totally. Like
Oh, okay.
I, so when I started going through puberty, I hit puberty pretty young. And so I guess I'll back up a little bit. I was born really early. I think I was born at like 31 or 32 weeks and I weighed a kilogram when I was born. So I had a bunch of odd developmental problems. Like I was a toe walker, and for that I got like Botox injections in my legs and more leg braces. Um, I also learned how to tie my shoes when I was like 14, and I had to learn how to swallow properly as well. When I was 14, like I had to learn that skill in speech therapy. So I had a bunch of odd developmental quirks, probably just due to prematurity, you know? But as far as the sort of gender dysphoria goes, I mean, I, as a kid, I was really just totally checked out. I was very disconnected from my body. I didn't totally realize that I was a girl. Like I didn't realize that I was female. I, as a kid, would in preschool, the teachers would discover me with wet pants, and they eventually realized that I was trying to urinate while standing. Um, I also had a phase, I think, right as I was hitting puberty, where I felt this desire to become extremely buff. So I would do a lot of like push-ups, sit-ups, pull-ups, and run around with my shirt off and like flex my muscles for girls. But I didn't necessarily think of it as being, in the wrong body because I hadn't fully developed, the psychological milestone of sex constancy. And that's a milestone that most kids finish developing at the latest by the age of 8. But usually they start, developing this idea that, I'm a boy or I'm a girl and that I am going to stay that way. Just because I put on a dress or a costume, it doesn't mean that I'm literally the thing that I'm dressing up as. So most kids develop that between 5 and 8. But I hit puberty, I guess, shortly before my 10th birthday, and I still hadn't developed that sense of sex constancy yet. I still basically, I mean, as soon as I started to notice pubertal changes, I was still in denial until the changes became so noticeable that I couldn't ignore them anymore. But I was still, when puberty started happening, I had this thought come in my mind, which is, whoa, like I actually am a girl. People aren't screwing with me.
Wow.
So I didn't have a real sense of, myself or being in the wrong body per se, but I did a lot of very like, I had a lot of very like sort of typical, I guess, traits of, your classic dysphoric child. The only difference being that I didn't exist, outside of my mind long enough to really be able to express that to anybody. But I remember I'd also heard of like the idea of intersex or hermaphrodites, as they were called back then on the internet or on the radio on the way to school, and I thought, oh, that must be me. I must be a hermaphrodite. So I mean, I did have in many
Okay.
ways dysphoria, but I probably just didn't express it in the typical way because I existed, almost entirely in my mind, at least until I was medicated for ADHD at the age of 14.
So that's really interesting. But back to your original story, what resonated with me while I was listening to you is that, frankly, it all seemed like a form of internalized homophobia, right? Like you didn't feel like that because you had crushes on girls, because you were feeling, the young attraction to other girls, because you liked men's clothing, which is kind of a made up concept anyway, right? Because you liked being friends with the boys and pulling pranks, you must actually be a boy, or you must become a boy in order to do those things, is the way you seemed to have looked at it. When in fact, what I would say is that there's nothing inherent to being female that says you can't do any of those things. Females can love other females, and that's perfectly fine. Females can wear men's clothing, which is, socially constructed anyway, what clothes men wear. It's different in many societies. Um, and females can like pranks. Females can have mostly male friends. To me, all of that seems like something that should just be a natural variation between, of how a person is. But instead, because of these very sharply ingrained gender roles and because of these expectations that I think most young people still internalize, that they're supposed to be straight, and of course they're supposed to be straight, and then over years and growing up they kind of have to grapple with that and realize it's not the case. It pushed you down that path, but I wonder if you ever would have gone there if we'd lived in a world, or you'd lived in a culture, a school, a community where it was just okay to be a girl and do those things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that the prevalence of strict, sex stereotypes and the nonconformity of certain subsets of people, like who just naturally, not even for a political statement, are nonconforming, such as people who are on the autism spectrum or have traits of that or have traits of ADHD and don't pick up on social cues and therefore are more likely to be gender nonconforming. And also homosexuals are very likely to be gender nonconforming in these specific ways. I think that the presence of these strict expectations is precisely what causes somebody to feel a sort of disunity between their mind and their body. And I know, especially with sort of teenagers, especially teenage girls, like teenage girls experience a lot of distress around puberty, and that's like pretty normal. And a lot of the distress that adolescent females feel around development in general, that distress becomes targeted towards their female bodies. And we've seen that historically with eating disorders. We've seen that with like all kinds of conversion disorders. And we know that girls are like sort of prone to their, and self-harm and things of that nature. They're prone to basically externalizing their internal distress on their body. But I think that as far as the gender roles bit goes, I don't think it's just a matter of sort of, we need to broaden our social expectations of what a boy and a girl can be. I think we need to go a step further. Like in my case, I didn't see any sort of representation of butch lesbians when I was growing up. The closest thing that I had really gotten to an understanding of like a possible trajectory that I could go down were trans men. That was like the first schema and framework that I had even found to give myself a model of like, what can I be or how can I grow up? And actually, I got into trans before I even realized that I was gay. Like I was having these crushes, sure, but I didn't realize that all of these weird symptoms in my body were in any way connected to the fact that my hand brushed by the hand of this other girl. And I certainly didn't know that this meant some kind of romantic attraction or some kind of a feeling that would blossom into this concept of love, which I had already known about. So I think there was a lot of just disconnection in general in my life, and that the trans framework really provided me a sense for who can I be when I grow up. And the answer I got based on that framework was, well, that I have this, ineffable gendered soul, this ineffable male soul that's unverifiable and not only unproven, but unprovable, and that I need to, and that it exists somehow separately from my body and my biological sex. And that therefore, because I have, a male brain or a male soul inside of a female body, the logic followed and continues to follow with modern trans activism, that I need to align my body with my mind through a series of like experimental and dangerous medical procedures that don't actually change your sex. So it makes total sense why I came to the conclusion that I came to with the information that I had.
Right, and it offered you this solution, but it turned out not to be a solution because you are a detransitioner. You no longer identify as transgender. Walk us through that. Like when did you start to have seeds of doubt, and what was it about you or about your experiences that led you to completely reconsider and do a 180?
Yeah. So I'd say there were several seeds of doubt along the way. I mean, my parents, they were not affirming. And they were really ahead of their time in that regard, because in 2012, the only people who knew about the idea of a trans kid were people who were transitioning their kids, or the few people who had seen like the Jazz Jennings, Barbara Walters special. It was not a well-known concept back then, but my parents had an instinct, especially because I come from like a Soviet Jewish background where there's naturally a lot of skepticism around institutions simply because they are institutions. So if a medical institution tells you that you must behave in X, Y, and Z ways, my parents are automatically sort of primed to not follow that. So my parents never affirmed. So that's one piece of the story. Another piece of the story, though, is basically that there was a lot of, especially in my house, sort of resistance to my gender nonconformity. I think precisely because of that Soviet Jewish background and just the absolute fear that my parents had that I wasn't going to be okay. like that this would cause me so many problems down the line that it needs to be corrected in the same way as my toe walking needed to be corrected, or in the same way as my not being able to tie my shoes or my lisp needed to be corrected. Like this was seen as another sort of deviation from the norm that goes into the realm of pathology that needs to be corrected. But as far as like, so where this all led with seeds of doubt is that I would say that the first seed of doubt that I really got, that I absolutely totally ignored, was in college. I was dating this girl, and we were reading the book Stone Butch Blues, and this book is really part of lesbian literary canon. And in this book, the main character is a butch who transitions, and in the process of that transition, she loses a lot of connection that she had with the lesbian community because people stop perceiving her as female. And this main character, the way she describes her relationship to her body, her relationship to other women, her relationship to her, particularly to her sexed body, the way she describes all of this really resonated with me. And so at that moment, I had somewhat of like an ocean moment, and I thought, wow, I have never given myself the chance to just live as a lesbian. But I filed that seed of doubt all the way in the back of my mind because there were no lesbian communities for me to turn to. I mean, by 2018, they had already all become queer or, infiltrated by straight men who claimed to be women. And so,
Well, let's
as
pause
far as
on
an
that. Let's
actual,
pause on that for a second. Were there really, so by 2018, were there really no lesbians? Because I mean, obviously we can talk about how like there are a lot of trans men who've taken over lesbian spaces, and I understand that some lesbians argue like they're becoming an extinct species. But at least for my age cohort, and I'm not that much older than you, there still were plenty of lesbians like around.
so I think that a few years makes a massive difference. Especially in the way that this movement has evolved, and especially because I was in one of these really progressive cities.
Mm-hmm.
And so within my age group, the term lesbian already had almost entirely stopped. Like people had stopped using it to describe themselves, if they were exclusively same-sex attracted women.
What would they
That
say instead?
cohort,
Queer?
yes. So,
Okay.
and queer doesn't, queer also encapsulates like straight people with quirky haircuts.
Yes.
So when I say that like there was no semblance of a lesbian community within my age cohort, that's what I mean. I'm not saying that there were lesbians, but they called themselves something different, and they would, based on this kind of amorphous queer label, group themselves with other people who shared that amorphous queer label, which includes, heterosexuals with, nose piercings and colored hair as well. So it's, as far as like the lesbian communities in the way that they've traditionally existed, where, there used to be an intergenerational type of mentorship, that definitely didn't exist where I was and within my age group. So I really had no way to sort of reconnect or just to connect in the first place to a lesbian identity.
So that was the first one,
Yeah.
was reading that book, but you pushed that
Yes.
down. So what's the
Oh,
next
absolutely.
stage?
So when my parents realized that this trans thing isn't going away, they basically stipulated that in order to continue helping me financially through college, that I would need to study abroad in a country that doesn't support all of this gender ideology stuff. And I'd previously been, and so I guess they wanted me to pick a country that wasn't Western, it wasn't European. And I really had a couple choices. The first one is Russia, because I already spoke Russian growing up, but it's a homophobic country, so I definitely did not want to go there. And then previously, I had actually been to Israel to study the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with a girl that I was dating at the time. And my first time, in both within Israel proper and in the West Bank, I had a few sort of key aha moments about, how I could possibly turn this stipulation that my parents gave me into something which could play into my advantage. So I guess I'll just tell you a story about one of those moments. After the seminar about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict was over, my girlfriend and I decided to extend our trip. And the two of us had gone into the West Bank. One night we spent in a refugee camp in Bethlehem, and the next day we spent in a Palestinian multi-millionaire's house that he was renting as an Airbnb. So about as two different backgrounds as he could possibly get, and these were in two different cities. And one day, my girlfriend and I, in our massive suitcases, found ourselves on a shared taxi, and we got off at the wrong stop. So we were in the wrong city entirely, and we were just totally desperate because Google Maps, especially in, I guess it would have been 2018 or 2019, Google Maps were not yet fully launched within the West Bank. So you really have to ask people and try to find your way around. So we were just desperately searching for somebody to tell us, like, how do we get to the city we're supposed to be in? And we walk past this coffee shop, and the owner comes out, sees us with our suitcases, and he can tell that we're tourists immediately. And he welcomes us in. He speaks to us in English. He says, welcome, come in. He gives us free hot dogs and free coffee. We have a great conversation. And I tell this guy, well, actually, I speak some Arabic because I'd been studying Arabic since I was 12. And so I told this guy that I spoke some Arabic. And we switched then to Arabic. And this guy, he refers to me in the masculine. And that's the moment in which I realized that, whoa, like, while in the United States, this type of presentation would get me read as a masculine woman, in this part of the world, they don't really know what a lesbian is. So I can use this to my advantage and basically live as a man. And I should also note that this cafe that my girlfriend and I were in, we looked around and there were only men in there. Because in Arab society, most of these types of places, like coffee shops, for example, are going to be sex segregated because it's a homosocial culture. So it turns out at that moment, that my girlfriend was really the exception to the, no women in the cafe, that unspoken rule, of course, because tourists get away with things that locals don't. So I had a bunch of crazy experiences while I was there before I had gone to study abroad that made me realize that actually in such a traditional society, I don't even have to medically intervene in my body. I can just go about life the way that I go about life in the United States. But here, I'll get what I want, which is to be perceived as a guy and to live my life as a guy.
And I imagine you're coming to this, but the natural question that emerges is that how did being perceived and passing as a guy in Israel and in the West Bank, how did that make you less firm in your trans identity? That feels like something that would solidify it.
Yeah, no, that's solidifying it. But the social transition, the reason I brought this up is because the social transition, it is not a neutral intervention, not for kids and not for young adults. It's not a neutral intervention. It's a powerful psychosocial intervention. And then if you include measures like binding or tucking, then it also becomes somewhat of a medical intervention that can cause harm to your physical body. But me doing this social transition and living my life as a guy in Israel, basically for 4 years, that is what made me think I'm on the right track in my life. This is a good idea. But it was only after I had lived like that for several years, and then a few other things happened in the meantime, that I realized that actually this social transition can't last forever, because at some point people will stop taking me seriously as a guy in his 20s. Like, at some point I will need to intervene in my body medically.
Which, to be clear, you had not done until this point. You weren't on testosterone.
No, because I was illegal in Israel for a few years, because the bureaucracy didn't know how to process my case, because I'm an American citizen with a Jewish background that's from the former Soviet Union. So basically, it was a bureaucratic nightmare that left me having no status in the country for 3 years.
So you weren't illegal, you were undocumented. We don't want to offend anybody. I kid. You it's fine. You were
Yeah.
there illegally.
I was there, with some kind of gray status, some sort of uncertainty. So I couldn't work legally. So what I ended up doing during that time was that I basically integrated myself both within Palestinian Muslim society and ultra Orthodox Jewish society, because I'm Jewish, but before I came to Israel, I already spoke Arabic. And then I picked Hebrew up when I was there. But when I was illegal, I worked within the ultra Orthodox Jewish sector of the society. So I was like a caterer and a cleaner because they'd pay in cash. You don't need a worker's visa for that. So I wore the whole getup. Like I had the yarmulke, I had the white shirt, the black pants, the ritual fringes, the tzitzit, that stick out from your shirt. I was cosplaying basically as an ultra Orthodox Jewish guy, and then I would come home from these cleaning jobs, and then I would party with my friends in the West Bank. And a lot of my friends didn't even know that. Oh, most of them didn't know that I was female, and some of them, the Palestinian ones, didn't even know that I was Jewish. So I was living multiple layers of a double life. And initially, it was amazing. It was so satisfying. I was doing what I'd always wanted to do. I was living out my sort of childhood dream. And I was able to do it really, really successfully. But of course, when you're female and you are passing yourself off to everybody as a male, there are, of course, complications that come with that and complexities, like socially. But I'd say so the reason I gave this background really is so that you sort of know where the doubts came in later. Because the only reason that I doubted this path is because I had spent so many years on it. So back to the story. So I was really enjoying my life living as a guy within Israel and the Palestinian territories. I got to speak 4 languages every day, just living my best life.
Are you like a language savant or something?
I don't know if I'm a savant. I really like languages. So I speak 4 languages: English, Russian, Arabic, Hebrew.
Wow. Good for you.
I really enjoy them. And it's what really allowed me to like integrate within Israeli society, because those are the 4 most commonly spoken languages over there. So I was really in my element. But I would say that what really made me question this entire trajectory of my life was really living through my first war in Israel. So I would actually say that my process of desistance from a trans identity, the real true seeds of doubt that I did end up following, albeit it took several years to follow those seeds of doubt, they were really planted in a bomb shelter in May of 2021.
Wow.
I was with a different girl this time, and we were going to a drag queen show in Tel Aviv. And so I was at her apartment, and we were just kind of delaying leaving the house, because the cats needed to be fed, and like it's just 2 people with ADHD, absolute planning chaos. So we were just saying, okay, after this task, we'll get on the bus and go. No, after this task. So we kept pushing, the departure. And suddenly, out of nowhere, I had heard a siren. And I look at this girl that I'm dating and I say, what's that? And she's like, that's a siren. And I'm like, what are we supposed to do? And then she says, we need to run to a bomb shelter. And I asked her, so where is the bomb shelter? She's like, I don't know. I'm new to this neighborhood. So we run down to the lowest level of the apartment complex because you're less likely to get hit by a rocket if you're on the lower level as opposed to the, higher above level. And eventually, there were so many sirens, and eventually we had figured out where the bomb shelter was. And we had these 2 cats that we had to pack up and take with us every single time, running back and forth, unloading the cats, loading up the cats. It was a massive ordeal. Meanwhile, I heard this siren, and I had to take all of these practical measures to save myself from a rocket, but my whole body was shaking and it felt like I couldn't move, but I had to move. So, I'd spend a lot of time in bomb shelters, which are just extremely depressing places to be because for somebody of my generation, especially, there's no Wi-Fi in there. So,
That's the concern, not the.
well, because you can't distract yourself.
So you
You're
just are
hearing
forced to confront your mortality then. I imagine that's actually probably a
exactly.
profound experience. And
Oh, it
for
wasn't.
Americans, I mean, and this is very unfortunate, but what you're describing about having to shelter like this is somewhat typical for an Israeli or a person living in Israel to have to do. That's not a rare experience.
No. So yeah, that questioning of my own mortality and having to come to grips with physical processes of body, that played a role, but it played a role in my desistance story much later. Initially, what I noticed, so while I was running in and out of these bomb shelters, when I was basically sort of waiting for the next siren, which you can never predict when it's going to happen, I would scroll through Instagram and I'd started to see, my leftist American friends basically arguing that Israelis deserve to live under rocket fire and basically justifying everything that was done in the name of the Palestinian people, including the terrorist group Hamas that was launching rockets at Israel, and that not only makes Israelis' lives a living hell, but also, terrorizes the Palestinian population within Gaza and uses them as human shields in order to launch these rockets, into Israel, and then, of course, hoping that Israel will retaliate and kill as many Palestinians as they possibly can because they're a terrorist group. And when I was, on the American left as a teenager and a young adult before I'd moved to Israel, I actually used to be one of these pro-Palestinian campus activists as a Jew. And that's actually the whole reason that I ended up in Israel, because basically the Jewish, campus organization had seen that a few Jews were on the pro-Palestinian side. And this campus organization called us in and said, hey, I understand that you're very intellectually, curious about this conflict, but I just feel like you're not getting the whole story. And that's why I was invited to apply for this program to study the conflict in Israel. And that's really the moment in which I realized that the left was lying to me. And the first realization came when I showed up there and I didn't even speak the same dialect of Arabic that these Palestinians spoke, because I had learned literary Arabic, which is not a spoken dialect. So that's the moment at which really I realized, whoa, I don't know anything. And so while I was looking at what my lefty American friends were posting online, I realized that actually they are coming from the place that I was coming from. I was operating, under the assumption that they don't have all of the information, and that if I am able to find them, credible sources that they can fact check, showing them that the same terrorist group that they're advocating for, because that terrorist group wants to obliterate Israel, that is the same terrorist group that is internally holding the Palestinians of Gaza hostage. My point was, you shouldn't be supporting these terrorists because not only are they terrorizing Israelis, but they're also terrorizing Palestinians.
You actually had encountered a large portion of young people who were not just pro-Palestinian, but were actually pro-Hamas, is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Absolutely. And even before Hamas, they were pro whatever terrorist action was ever taken, in order to quote unquote liberate Palestine. Although these terrorists are not liberatory forces, because they, first and foremost, when they're not hell-bent on killing Jews, they're hell-bent on policing Palestinian society with an iron fist. So basically, when I was seeing my leftist American friends defending terrorists, I was operating under the assumption that they didn't have a full set of facts, and that if I were to give them really solid, credible evidence and data that to show them that Hamas is a terrorist group, that they would include that within their logical calculus and come to a more informed and comprehensive
view. Oh, you sweet,
view.
Sweet summer child. I'm guessing that didn't work.
No, your guess would be correct. It did not work. Instead, they got really mad at me, which kind of shocked me. because these are all people who I knew from high school debate. I was a high school debater, you know, similar to you. We had this experience with rhetoric and with being able to analyze arguments critically. So these are all people I did debate with in high school, people whose logical reasoning and whose grasp of rhetoric I had really respected because we all went through the same training. So I was quite surprised when, instead of including my arguments within their logical calculus, these people started shouting names and resorting to all kinds of ad hominem attacks that every debate kid knows you're not supposed to use because they're not valid arguments. They started calling me a colonizer and a settler sympathizer. And that's really the moment in which two major things happened that made me question this trajectory of my life, including transition. The first of these is that I realized that even the most intellectual and intelligent thinkers who were associated with the left seemed to be absolutely incapable of reconciling arguments that, you know, don't fit in within their dogmatic views. It seemed like, you know, their thinking was not really intellectual, although they used a lot of intellectual jargon. They were not synthesizing, you know, any data or any evidence within their worldview. They were simply discrediting everybody, you know, with ad hominem attacks who didn't agree with them. So that really disillusioned me from the left, realizing how many people on the left were just absolutely anti-Semitic, just claiming to be pro-Palestinian. So that's one thing that sort of changed my trajectory, was that I started to become disillusioned with the Western left.
That's interesting because I was never on the left. I'm not one of these people with a why I left the left story, right? I was started kind of apolitical or in the center and then moved right and then moved back towards the middle somewhat is my trajectory. But what I've heard from a lot of them is that it's like once the dam broke a little bit, it ended up exploding wide open. Like one thing that through some twist of fate or life experience they learned within, you know, left-wing dogma wasn't quite correct. They started to question it. And instead of, you know, having a debate, having a conversation, they were attacked or ostracized. And then they kind of started to see that the emperor is wearing no clothes, right? Like there's a lot here that's actually wrong and flawed. And so what I'm hearing you say is that when you realize that one thing that this ideology had glommed onto and held as a indisputable principle was flawed and incorrect, you started to question all of it, and that led you back to gender identity. But what happened from there? How did it unfold further?
So yeah, that's a good question. So what happened from that moment was that, so I was already starting to be disillusioned with the left, but because I had lived outside of the United States for a few years at that point, I hadn't seen how any of these political conversations were evolving in real time because I was abroad. But in the process of basically trying to search for credible evidence to prove to my lefty American friends that you know, that they're supporting a terrorist group, we know that computer algorithms are very powerful. And in the process of searching for this, you know, pro-Israel content, which was aligned with, you know, other ideas in the basket of like acceptable ideas, they belong to the right-wing side of the political spectrum. I had naturally been, you know, introduced to more content which was in line with the right wing of the political spectrum. And that included stuff about the George Floyd protests and Black Lives Matter and things of that nature. But eventually, as I'd started to view that content, the algorithm had suggested me stuff about gender ideology, about the transgender movement, which had really exploded in the United States, you know, exactly in the years since I had left to live in Israel. And this shocked me because when I got into trans, I was 12 in 2012. It was it was entirely unheard of within my peer group. I had seen my peer group start to get more involved in it sort of 4 years after I had started identifying as trans. But the trend already, because I grew up in such a progressive place, was non-binary. And from the moment I'd heard of non-binary, I really came to the conclusion that, this is not what I am. Like, this is not the same thing as what I'm feeling. I don't want to be in between. I want to live a normal life where people won't give me shit for wanting to wear vests and bow ties, and where I can, walk outside and hold a girl's hand and not have anybody question why I'm in the relationship that I'm in. So I really wanted to be normal, and I saw that, transitioning and becoming an imitation of a heterosexual male was going to be, the best way for me to like grow up and blend in seamlessly within society.
But you see how sad and how rooted in internalized homophobia that thought process is. Like, my heart goes out to younger you for actually internalizing and experiencing that.
Yeah, it's very difficult. And I would say that really, so I guess we all try to cope and grapple with things the best that we can, like with the resources and the information that we have. For me, the trans identity did have some kind of a utilitarian purpose at that time, because it did allow me to destigmatize within myself, my attraction to women and my desire to wear, dapper, fashionable menswear. The trans identity allowed me to allow myself to do that. However, I built my entire sense of self from the age of 12 under the false premise that because I like these things, and because I like women, and because I relate to men much better than I relate to women, because I like logic and analysis, and just all of these, because of all these traits that I have, it means that I have a male brain or a male soul, and B, that therefore means that my body is wrong, that my female body existing in its healthy, natural state is a state of pathology that needs to be overcome with, experimental and dangerous medical interventions from the moment I become financially independent from my parents. Like, I had staked my entire life on transition. And so coming back from that has been really, really difficult. But I feel like I'm jumping around a lot here. To go back to the point that you discussed in regards to desistance. So eventually, I had been in the rabbit hole of conservative thought, I guess you can call it. And I'd been exposed to, the reactions to woke TikToks that are basically just making fun of trans-identified people. And I watched it, and it made me realize, like, the extent to which, this sort of transgender phenomenon had blown up within the Western world, and especially within American society. It was pretty shocking, because I had never really been entrenched within the trans community, even when I was trans identified. I mean, I'm not the type of person to really stick with one tribe. It's never really been my thing. Like, I'm a Russian-speaking, Arabic-speaking Jew. So even in Israel, I didn't stick to one tribe. I was like somewhat of a peace activist, and I did a lot of peace activities. But so I had been going down the gender critical rabbit hole. I'd seen these compilations of reactions to woke TikToks, and the more and more I started, getting into the trans idea and exploring it from a more critical perspective, the more I realized that, that the path that I'd staked my entire future on was actually going to present me a lot more problems than I had initially realized, including medical complications. And I really started to realize the impracticalities of a medical transition living through multiple wars. Because there was one time that I remember running in and out of bomb shelters and just thinking, like, what if I were in the hospital right now recovering from top surgery, an elective radical double mastectomy, and I wouldn't be able to move my hands above my shoulders? What would I do in this moment if I heard a siren? I wouldn't be able to run to the bomb shelter and save myself. What would happen to me then? And I'd also known, because I'd been doing such in-depth research into these medical interventions since I was 12, I also knew that, copious amounts of testosterone flowing through the female body causes the atrophy of the female reproductive system, and that often after several years on testosterone, women who take testosterone need to have a hysterectomy and remove their reproductive organs because they can go septic and that can be fatal. And from that moment, your body can't produce any sex hormones. And if there's anything more dangerous to the human body than, having copious amounts of cross-sex hormones flowing through your body, it's actually having absolutely no sex hormones in your body. And I had realized that, I can't predict when these wars are going to happen. I can't predict how long they will last for or the impact of that on supply chains. And I might not be able to access hormones during times of war. And this can be absolutely catastrophic. So that's a realization that I'd started to have really around my second war in Israel, that I do need my body to stay fully intact, in order for me to be able to survive whatever life can throw at me.
So, was there a final moment for you where the light switch flipped, or was it kind of a slow glacier melting?
It was, in a way, it was both. There was a long process of sort of unindoctrinating myself, and there were a few really key moments in that process. One of them is that as soon as I became legal and left Israel for a little vacation, I ended up at a conference and I'd gotten to meet detransitioners in real life. And the detransitioners that I met in real life had much more diverse stories than the few detransitioners who are covered within mainstream media, who mostly are, feminine and heterosexual young women who basically go from trans to being very gender conforming members of their sex. And I didn't want to do that because that just wasn't me. And so that's what made me scared of detransitioning for a while, until I had met, butch lesbian detransitioners and realized that even masculine lesbians who have a very similar story to mine, and who even have a very similar story to your classic, quote unquote, true transsexual, old school transsexual, that child onset gender dysphoria, the incongruence, which is really more evidence of a likely homosexual trajectory than anything else. But I had realized that there are people who are very similar to me who aren't these typical, feminine girls who got caught up in this peer-to-peer social contagion and then they still regretted it. That was one major light bulb moment for me. But additionally, what really sealed the deal, I would say, was really my third war in Israel. It seems like the wars that I've been through have really played a massive role in sort of uncovering this next sort of phase of my life. And it's really that, so on October 7th, I was actually supposed to be at one of the festivals that Hamas raided.
Wow.
Yeah, so I was supposed to be there, but a few days before then, my sober ride fell through, and I thought it was really annoying at the time, and a massive inconvenience. But I decided to do instead some peace activism. I decided, okay, so the festival isn't happening. So on October 6th, I decided to instead go to this sort of peace event between Jewish and Arab children in a Bedouin village. And it was so rewarding because these kids, they didn't even have a common language. And they didn't need one because they were so young. They just played with each other. And it made me realize, I was so naive, and I really thought that, what I saw was something beautiful happening within these kids, because they didn't need a common language in order to communicate. They would just play, and it was really the nearest adult to any given child who would help them up if they fell down. And it didn't matter if they spoke the same language or were, a member of the same religion. And it was so hopeful, because by the end of the event, each kid had already learned some words of Arabic or Hebrew or Russian or French or English, whatever they were speaking, and they were developing real friendships. And so I went on Instagram and I was saying, guys, we have no control over what, warmongering politicians and terrorist groups in the region are going to do to drive us apart. But what we can control is the way we educate our kids. We just need to educate them together and to have them speak each other's languages. And we can make peace on the ground. And then I go home, and within a few hours, I wake up to the sound of a siren. And my life changes forever. And this war was a bit different because not only did you have the rockets, but you had terrorists who were running loose within the country.
Mm-hmm.
And I was starting to get bits of information. Like I had opened my Facebook and I saw an execution being live streamed. And I later figured out that that was my friend being executed
Wow.
on camera. Um, and that experience, like, it shook me in ways that I only realized, once I came back to the United States. Because when you're in the middle of something like that, you just have to focus on survival and survival alone. So I was trying to figure out what the hell was going on because I could tell that this war was different because we don't normally get rockets in the city that I lived in. So I already knew that something was up, and I was doing the same thing of running in between, bomb shelters, and then figuring out, well, can I go into the bomb shelter because there were already stories of terrorists invading these bomb shelters and killing the people who were inside. So I was terrified, and my normal sort of protocol that I had developed and that every Israeli had developed in dealing with these circumstances were not really options because your safe rooms were no longer safe. And there were so many missiles coming in that we didn't know whether the Iron Dome would be able to keep up with all of them. So I was totally discombobulated, and everybody in that neighborhood knew me as a guy. But from the moment that I woke up at 8 a.m. to this siren, I didn't have time to put my binder on in order to, because it's a tight compression garment that takes quite a bit of time to actually wriggle yourself into. So I didn't have the time to do that. And I basically just put on, I grabbed the closest shirts, layered them up, to obscure the fact that I have breasts because everybody knew me as a guy. And I just had to run as fast as I can to the bomb shelter across the street because I had already, lost so much time. And the feeling of feeling my body, move unconstricted. Of course, it was uncomfortable because I had a lot of distress around my breasts and my female body in general. And it was physically uncomfortable to run without that type of compression. But having to do that so many times and never being able to predict when I would be able to take the binder off, or even to take a shower, for example, because there's nothing worse than being in the middle of a shower with soap in your hair, and then you hear a siren and you have to run to a bomb shelter. So you basically stay kind of frozen in time. And I realized that I don't have time to put on this binder and take it off. And I can't sleep in this thing anymore. I've already done that too many times, and it has harmed my body. And so at that moment, really a lot of things clicked into place, and I realized that there's something really important about having my female body as it is, fully intact, because my body, while I used to think of it as a pathology that needs to be fixed to match my, intergendered soul, I started to think of my body as really the only thing that I have that is mine that will save me during these types of wars and these really rough times. And I need my body to, I realized, I guess, that at that moment that my body was capable and not a pathology, and that I need to preserve my body as best as I can, really, in order to survive.
Wow. Well, that's a very powerful story. It sounds like you had to go through some really extreme stuff to make that realization. I guess one final note on this is are you glad that you weren't medicalized completely? You weren't put on testosterone or put on the pipeline towards, imagine if you'd been given puberty blockers and then cross-sex hormones and then top surgery at 18 or 17 or 19. And then you had this experience and realized how it wasn't a good fit for you. I mean, that would be a really tragic place to have been in. So, I mean, you have to be grateful for the fact that that wasn't your experience, but I imagine you must worry about the others for whom that will be the case.
Absolutely. And it's the thing that has saved me really both from death by terrorists and also from, irreversibly changing my body and incurring health consequences, some of which are pretty predictable and some of which are entirely unpredictable, were really just a set of different coincidences, really inconveniences that ended up saving me. Both like in October 7th, that was actually not the first terrorist attack that I had survived because of a sheer coincidence. There was another time when a cat scratch saved me from a terrorist attack, and a previous time when it was like a gnarly headache, stomachache duo that saved me from a different terrorist attack. So, and additionally, just being illegal and not having access to healthcare and not having access to, the ability to work like legally and to change my documents to sort of reaffirm this false belief that I'm male. It was really just a series of coincidences that ended up really saving me in that regard. And I was just so hell-bent on transitioning that, that's really why I wanted to become an Israeli citizen. I wanted to, and now I am, but I moved to Israel in order to transition away from my non-affirming parents.
Wow.
That was the goal. And the moment that I became an Israeli citizen, like the same day, I already signed myself up with a gender clinic.
Wow.
So I was, and it's the slow nature of Israeli bureaucracy that really also saved me. Things that in the time when they happen, I think of as major inconveniences, massive annoyances, end up actually saving me from something. And I worry, that most people don't have a crazy enough life where they end up in a war-torn or war-prone country, where they have to put their belief system of this gender identity, which it is a belief system because it's not something you can touch or prove. It's something that you have to accept exist without any kind of sort of verifiable metrics. And I found that, I think in the West, this gender ideology, it has captured so many institutions, from education to courts, to medicine, and just, legally in general, this ideology has subsumed so many aspects of American society and so many institutions that people who transition nowadays will not be able to reality test this path that they're going down. And by the time they realize that, fighting your nature and fighting your biology at every step, the moment that you realize that there are complications and that this process doesn't lead to just a cleaning up of all of your issues and a solution to all of your issues, which is the way it is being pushed at people. It is an all-encompassing framework that sort of makes people rationalize all kinds of different amorphous feelings of distress, and some of them are less amorphous than others. Like for some people, this gender dysphoria really is focused on specific body parts, or it is focused on the way they're socially perceived. But also sometimes, the idea of gender dysphoria, it's kind of like, I kind of liken it to a horoscope. Because it's basically a diagnosis that encompasses all kinds of feelings of distress. And that includes distress and nonconformity. And that includes, the little kids who present at gender clinics, usually they're little boys, who are most likely to grow up to be gay. And we know this because back when the treatment protocols were watchful waiting, which is just let the kid go through puberty and see what happens, most of the kids desist and they just, grow up to be gay.
Right.
So whether we're talking about those kids or whether we're talking about these teenage girls who, for a variety of reasons, latch onto the trans idea and the trans framework, whether it's because of a history of abuse or neurodivergence or also possible homosexuality or just the struggle of coping with female puberty, or whether we're talking about the gender dysphoric population who is autogynephilic, for example, where the nature of their distress is a direct result of their paraphilia, of their of the fact that they are sexually aroused by the idea of themselves as women and or as of having female biological functions. Like, that's the nature of their dysphoria. And then if we talk about, for example, the butch lesbians who have been transitioned in mass, really for the last, medically for at least the last 30 years, these are all just totally different populations of people who are described under the same label, even though the nature of the distress in all of these cases, it stems from a different place. But yet, this framework of a gender identity, a mismatch between the gender identity and your biological sex becomes the all-encompassing framework in which all of these people who have different ideologies entirely are looked at and who are diagnosed through, and they're all put on the same path. And this is done without any kind of solid evidence base for any of these interventions to occur, and certainly for any of these interventions to be considered, to be medical treatments.
All right, Maia. Well, we have to wrap up your story there a little early. We're going to have you back on for a longer conversation about more of this stuff. But thank you so much for being open and vulnerable and talking about your experience. I'm sure it can't be easy. It's been really great hearing your story and having you on the podcast. So thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much, Brad. I really enjoyed this conversation, and I definitely look forward to speaking with you in the future.
All right, everybody, that is it for this episode of the Damage Control Podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in. Please do consider subscribing and sticking around, and don't forget to hit that like button before you head out. With that, we'll talk again next week.